Tak fordi I er kommet. I må undskylde mit engelsk, fordi mit første skandinaviske sprog var dansk, og det er ikke ret nyttigt her. Så jeg skal tale engelsk til jer. I hope you do not mind. Right. My name is Sухино-Хоменко. And the project I'm presenting today started as a diploma thesis that I defended in Moscow in 2013. It has now been supervised by Henrik Jansen, who unfortunately couldn't be here today with us due to the teaching duties, as far as I understand, and Lars Hammonson. And the project bears a preliminary title, Viking-Age Things in England and Scandinavia, a comparative study. To begin with, I have posed at least 4 major research questions that I'm willing to address. First of all, who were the Thegns? If you check up the existing historiography, the traditional answer will differ depending on the region. In England, they're said to be either retainers of the kings, that is, but not only, or a kind of, proto-gentry, you might call them. And in Scandinavia, there has been an ongoing debate whether the Thegns we know of were retainers of the kings or local independent aristocracy. Which of the 4 opinions is closest to wie es eigentlich gewesen war remains to be answered. But there are other questions too, such as, were there any connections? Did the term or concept of a Thegn evolve with time? Was there any mutual influence? And from my knowledge, the current historiography doesn't answer these questions, let alone pose them. Why is this so? Well, I call it a historiographical vicious circle. There are 3 main approaches to the problem, each with its strong and weak sides, but they appear rather disconnected from each other. It is most apparent from the relationship between the Scandinavian and the British scholars. So the former do read the latter, second-hand works that is, but the latter do not return the favor, and so to speak, it is a one-way dialogue, if a dialogue can be one way. So what one of my objectives is, so to speak, is to tie the 2 traditions together. What I suggest is to start with a linguistic analysis, then explore the least biased or influenced upon sources from the respective regions, and then move on to the less clear-cut sources, and finally try to reach a synthesis, if it is even possible. Methodologically, I rely on 3 main cornerstones or techniques. One is context analysis. Instead of starting my research with applying the standard dictionary definition of a Thegn, I will rather try to find my own. This is important because the chronology of the extant sources is of paramount importance. A great many scholars tend to project the information of the younger source material onto the earlier epoch, which is hardly warranted, I say. Finally, I hope to exploit the databases that become more and more available these days. Bases such as the electronic SOA, electronic SOA, that is the collection of all extant Anglo-Saxon diplomas, can yield a lot of statistical data. I'll just bring one example here. You can see this is a map I put together for my previous research, and it's a map of where the English Thegns used to receive land grants from the kings, and it has been put up by me with the help of the electronic SOA, with the help of the information from the diplomas. Another example, this time from Scandinavia. Here you can see a map of where the rune stones that mentioned Thegns are to be found. It has been first made available in 2001 by Birgit Soya, by the way, the late wife of Peter Soya, whose index of the Anglo-Saxon charters has been used for the database I just mentioned earlier. You might ask me, what does it all matter? The way I see it, answering the research questions I brought up in the beginning can offer at least three main results. First, my humble source work can enrich our understanding of these sources. I will give you a brief example. So, here's the map that I've shown you earlier. You can see that the land donations are very unevenly distributed in England. This alone might lead you to certain conclusions, and I have drawn my conclusions in my diploma thesis, but aren't they premature? Let's look at where the corresponding charters have been preserved. A little detail here. The only archives that contain such charters in England of the period we are discussing are those of the monastic houses. By comparing the two maps, one might think they are very correlated, which might be expected. But if we look at the map of the active ecclesiastical foundations around the year 1060, it won't match either of the two. So you can see that there clearly are some monastic houses and religious houses outside the regions where the Thegns used to receive lands, or at least such conclusion can be drawn from those maps. Why is that? My point is that we need to pose the question of whether the extant corpus is representative. Something, as far as I know, hasn't been addressed on the larger scale. The second result I expect is to add a new dimension to our understanding of how the two coasts of the North Sea were connected at the time. Recently, it has ever more been revealed that those were far from isolated from each other on the social level too. And finally, I hope that my, case study of sorts can offer one of the possible ways to transcend the disciplinary borders. I hate to brag, but I hope that the fact that I'm a foreigner can actually become my gain here. I belong to neither of the historiographical traditions, and I humbly claim to offer a view from the outside. And with that being said, I thank you very much for coming and for your attention. And if there are any questions, I'm more than looking forward to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Questions? Comments? Wojtek?
Yeah. I have tons of questions, but just what exactly do you mean by statistical analysis in the context? When you use statistical analysis for locations, what things occur within the same sentences in order to define what you do, what you are?
Well, I cannot give you a definitive answer right now, but the way I see it is that instead of trying to pick single cases of when land was donated to that thing or the other thing, we should try to look at it from the bird's flight view, so to speak. We should try to analyze all available charters and make a map similar to one that I, for example, made here, and try to see where the land was donated. Why is this important? It is important because, on the one hand, the majority of the sources we have come from from one or the other way Wessex, and you can see that there's a correlation. Wessex would be historically would be here. Then you've got the English part of England, which is the Greater Wessex, which is roughly here. So there seemed to be a correlation. But we also know that there existed things outside this region. Were those people who received the lands here, were they indeed connected to the kings? Because, if you put a chart together, you'll see that only 14% of the land donations have been donated outside the Greater Wessex. Why is that? Maybe it will yield some results, maybe it won't. The same thing is true for the Doomsday material. Unfortunately, I haven't got a map because I haven't fully assessed this source, but it appears that the things are mentioned very differently in the Doomsday book. You will probably find many more of them outside this region. Why is that? I do not have a definitive answer yet. If that answers your question. So statistics can probably tell us where where this class group stratum was most prominent. Maybe why, if it was connected to the kings, it might give you an answer that the kings had the lands that to distribute here. All sorts of things, so to speak.
Yeah. Pablo? How many grants are you going to investigate, and what is the distribution in time?
This is a very good question, and this is a sort of an enigma in itself, because overall electronic soil lists almost 1900, but that includes all documents drawn between roughly 600 and 1086, and that it leaves out the charters drawn by the Norman kings. But the interesting issue is that the types of charters are different. So we've got the diplomas. So those are the solemn charters that donate land, or they rather test the land donation, but we've also got writs. Writs are very short addresses to localities about a decision made by the king, and those are concentrated in the 11th century only. We've got wills, we've got bequests. All of those must be analyzed, but I will probably not start from, the 7th century. Firstly, because there are too few. Secondly, because it's difficult. Thirdly, because it's beyond my scope. But this map has been put together on the material of roughly, let me recall, something like 250. But there are also about 200 in favor of the church from the same period, and about 200 in favor of other people, earls, reeves, some people whose status we do not know. And so from my period, from roughly 900 to 1066, there are about 650. And this can also answer the statistical question. For example, does this map correlate with what we see how land was donated in favor of the church, or does it correlate with how it was distributed in favor of other people? Is there a connection? Is this unique, so to speak? I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Elizabeth? Yes, it seems like a very interesting project, and it's in particular this comparison with the Anglo-Saxon world and the Scandinavian world. But I have a question. In the presentation, it seems that you, for example, when you showed us, you contextualize the 10 inscriptions in the Anglo-Saxon and Norman world, like, for example, the breaking down by shires and by archives and the monastery houses, as you mentioned. But I wonder, do you plan to contextualize or sort of analyze the runic material, the limestone material,
of course,
in the same way? And could you explain a little bit how you plan to do that?
Now, let me see. Where? That's not the one. Thank you very much for this question. I was sort of waiting for it. Can I please have this map? PowerPoint, will you? What is that you can see? Yeah, this is a very good question, because this map has been put together by Birger Soe, and it poses lots of questions. Okay, we know that there are very few runestones in Norway itself, so it's not very surprising that we do not find any there. I mean, there are not many to begin with, but we know that the majority of the runestones are to be found in Sweden, and yet we can see that altogether there are about 45, and 15 of them are in Denmark. So it's so to speak, the proportion is very much not representative, I think. Why is it connected? And those are supposed to be the earlier than those in Sweden. So those in Sweden are roughly dated to the middle of the 11th century, while those in Skåne and in Denmark are roughly dated to the end of the 10th century. The problem is the dating, because runestones do not offer much of a context. But again, there was, for example, a very interesting article by Judith Jesh, whom I'm very happy to know, who analyzed the word Thane on the runic inscriptions in one of the regions around the lakes, in which she actually observed that there was a formula a thing of strength, and she actually believes that it could be a kenning. It could not reflect any social stratum or whatever. Again, this needs to be analyzed. The problem is that we've got altogether there are about 50, whereas we have hundreds of charters. So statistics does work, but is more problematic. But it is of paramount importance because, as has been outlined by Jan Paul Strid, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his name, it was an article from 1986, as far as I remember, where he actually showed that linguistically the form in which the word Thegn is recorded on the Swedish runestones is definitely Swedish. It has undergone the breaking process. It's something like Thikn or Thign, whereas in England you would expect a Thegn or something different, which means that wasn't a lone word. And this is always, or very often overlooked by the British scholars. The British scholars do not seem to know about this map altogether, which is very surprising. I didn't know about it before I started my doctoral thesis. I thought they only existed in England. If that is the answer.
Sorry, I will follow up on this as well, but just as you present it right now, it seems like it's fairly descriptive. Purpose of your thesis, right? Like, who were the Thegns? What did they do, right? But is there any kind of broader or more general sociological question behind it?
Yep.
And could you elaborate on this? Because, like, in general, it's not very surprising that you will find differences between Scandinavia and England, especially towards the turn of the millennium, because they are actually very different societies in terms of power distribution and so on, and level of literacy and so forth. So, is there some more general trouble you want to tell us about with your thesis at the end of it?
Well, as I mentioned in my last slide, I think there are. First of all, I agree with you that we should expect to find discrepancies. The surprising fact is maybe how similar actually the results can be, but I cannot speak on this behalf right now. And probably we should probably invite Carl Löwing, who has written a lot of works about things on the runestones. But I think what I'm trying to do is, beside the first point, what I'm trying to do is to, on the one hand, bring the historiographical traditions together, because, again, as I said, they seem very detached from each other. And I see it as a problem because, as you said, the region was very much interconnected. But when the Anglo-Saxonists approached the Viking-Age, they see it from their perspective. When the Viking-Age scholars address the Anglo-Saxon material, they see it from their perspective. So my case study can bring forward a way how to sort of transcend these borders. On the other hand, this is a historiographical dimension. In the historical dimension itself, I hope to show that those societies might not have been as different, or maybe not as alike as we used to think, but also maybe it can be a founding stone for my later projects, because it appears that these social models have been followed up on the continent and in Russia too. And I hope that I can elaborate on that later on. For example, we know that there's a Russian word for a Prince Reeve, Tiun, which used to be credited to come from the word Thegn, but in fact it comes from the word for slave, the Thur. And why is that? Also a very interesting question. So, plus, if I've got the time and if Henrik and Lars allow me to, I would like to maybe have a little chapter or maybe sub-chapter connecting the material with, for example, contemporary Germany, with the ministeriales. Did they fulfill the same roles? Did they operate as king's agents? All sorts of... Maybe even as far as Japan with their samurai. But I think that would be a bit too far-fetched. That would be a bit too far-fetched.
So, are there any more questions?
No, I think we had to move on. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.